Esther Begay folded the thin wool blanket over the cold space where her husband had once slept and felt the hollow left by a body, by a promise, by a life mapped out in straight lines. At 38, she knew the land like the lines of her hands, the slope where wild onions grew after the spring rains, the drain that kept the steers from wandering in winter, the exact bend in the arroyo where the Navajo elders warned the wind kept its old stories. She had been a medicine woman longer than some women half her age had children. Her hands held pulse and bark and bone. Her tongue could sing away fever and stitch skin closed with sinew and patience. But a set of signed papers and a gun-courting deputy had taken everything the winter the rigid men in the county called law decided they needed land. They said women like her, Navajo, stubborn, too old to be a bride, couldn't own a claim they hadn't formally filed. They said the map was the law, and the law did not care for ceremonial whispers. They called her husband a drunk and declared his signature null because he had died drunk in the back of the saloon they now christened a boarding house. Esther had watched the sheriff's ledger scratch their names into oblivion and had felt the nettled sting of injustice when the chain of title was auctioned to the highest bidder, a man who had once favored the cavalry with whiskey and now favored the court with clumsy deeds. The town's respectable men signed and nodded, and when she asked for time, they gave her the echo of a laugh. It was not only land she had lost. The whitewashed courthouse had taken the last letter from her mother, an envelope held in prayer during the long night of fever, and a box of carved sheep her father had made. Her friends' glances cooled. She felt the way her name tasted in the mouths of storekeepers, like a coin they wished their pockets held. She could have folded into the hogan and sewed the memory flat the way she did softening hides. And she did, for a while. She tended to the cough of an old woman, grounded corn with a rhythm that steadied her, mended shirts with stitches that kept her hands from shaking. But there was a hardness beneath that quiet that did not bend. She had been raised with the story of changing woman, the one who remade herself, and with that power remade the people. Esther held that myth and the stubbornness of her clan. She would not let a paper do to her what the fever had not. If the men took deeds, she kept the land in the way that mattered, by knowing where the water pooled, where a foal could hide, which roots would staunch a bleed. She walked the border of her claim like a prayer vigil. She spoke to the junipers about what had been taken, and sometimes the wind answered. The day she found the gunslinger, it was raining in a way that made the arroyo a ribbon of dark silk. She had gone out with herbs in a basket, not for any pitying hospital call, but because a neighbor's child coughed and the cedar and willow could ease his chest. On the path back, she found tracks, spurred and heavy, and a musty smear of blood in the muck. At first, she thought cattle. Then she found him, half hidden behind a rock, propped on an elbow, a Winchester still cooling like it had been laid down with a promise. He had an ugly, blackened tear on his thigh where a bullet had entered, and an ugly, rough odor from the wound, and the man himself smelled like metal and smoke and the road. His face was too young for the war it wore. His jaw had a promise of a beard and a line of grief. He opened a dusty eye and looked at her, really looked. And Esther saw there a man who had been shot out of his ride and left to die because someone declared him an outlaw and a bounty. He was no burden. He was a map to a choice. He croaked, "Ma'am." She had no claim on him. She had no desire to tie her fortunes to some white man's fate, but she had medicine in her hands and a clean place in her head. Her grandmother had taught her that a life was a life. A man dying here would mean weeks of maggots in the bone and the soil swallowing what remained of his dignity. And she saw, too, in the man's eyes, a flicker of something like honor, enough that she fished his name from his mouth, Jonah Crow. "You'll bleed out," she said, not waiting for gratitude. He smiled with the edge of a man who'd expected worse. "Fix me, then. I'll not be nothing else." She weighed the risk of sheltering a wanted man against the risk of dying him out in the arroyo. Shelter an outlaw, and the cavalry might come. Leave him, and life would keep its clean ledger. But the injustice that had taken her land was not a one-time theft, it was licensed cruelty. Helping this man would not bring her deed back. It might make things worse. And yet, there was a stubbornness in her the same as in Jonah. She felt the country's bones under her feet and decided she would draw a line between what the law said and what she would allow to be right. "You stay quiet," she said, and handed him a cloth wrung with bitter tea. Her voice had the cool authority of a woman who dealt with the fever of babies, the rage of a widow, the lean of hungry years. "I stitch, you breathe." He muttered something that might have been thanks and dozed. She wrapped him in the blanket, took his gun and checked it, carefully unblocking the chamber of any lingering bullets, and then shouldered the risk. She put his saddle on a mule and led him along the trail that turned away from the stagecoach road, toward a place the county maps did not know, her mother's old hogan, hidden by a stand of junipers and built behind a bluff where the wind flattened its face. The outlaw's presence would call storms, but the bigger storm, what she'd already survived, had taught her this: to hide the hurt, yet not hide the strength. When she closed the hogan door, she tied it with sinew and prayer, and then, in the low blue light, she knelt beside him and began the work she had been taught, cleaning, binding, whispering words meant to pull a soul back from the edge. Her hands smelled of willow and iron. Outside, the wind scraped the world like an old pot, but inside the medicine woman lit a little fire and began to stitch. And in that small heat, a choice, an alliance, had been born. The first night, Jonah slept like a man wrung out by desert heat. His breath was a small storm beneath the blanket. Esther listened to it the way one listens for wolves when a child sleeps in the next room, vigilantly. She had bound the bullet wound as best she could with willow and the suture of deer tendon. She had given him willow tea for pain and a paste of crushed yucca and clay to keep the wound from souring. He had a fever that made his teeth tremble, and she sat with him through the hours, cooling his brow with a cloth scented with sage. When he opened his eyes in the pre-dawn and tried to stand, she put a solid hand on his shoulder. "You move too fast," she said, half counsel, half command. Her voice had the patience of someone who had held many frightened things. He laughed, a small, rusty sound. "Haven't had much practice with stillness." That sentence made her consider him more deeply. The man was not merely a name with a price. He was a map of miles and choices. His hands, when he finally lifted his head, were used to hard work, tying knots, steadying a horse, wiping the slick from a rifle. He knew how to read a horizon. That knowledge had value. The day they left her hogan, she saw him on his feet and knew their alliance would be practical as well as necessary. When the cavalry came, cleaned boots, polished brass, a lieutenant with the kind of politeness that carried the weight of homes in its smile, Esther had him wrapped in extra blankets and hidden in her smokehouse where dried meats hung, and she sang the old medicine songs as the patrol passed the hogan. They questioned her about strangers, about whether she had seen men in the brush. She told the truth in the way of women who know both language and silence. She had seen tracks like any other travelers. They'd nodded and gone on because they believed the land owed them a map that matched their papers. It was not only cavalry that made them move. A rival gang, men who had once drunk beside Jonah at campfires and had kept a ledger of small sins against him, started asking questions. They came with a swagger, salty and sure, their collars flecked with tobacco and old flame. One of them recognized Jonah's tell, a scar at the knuckle. Another remembered a story told in a tavern. They rode a track that brought them almost to Esther's hogan, and she felt the hair on her forearm prick. This was where her competence mattered. She did not simply hide Jonah. She taught him to be part of the hiding. He learned how to wrap herbs to mask human scent, and where to tuck the mule to keep a hoofprint pattern less readable. He learned to size the arroyo for escape, how to find a brittle thorn that could serve as a splint. She showed him the places she grew chamisa, and how to boil juniper berries into a concentrate that would stop a bleeding longer than any store medicine. And he taught her the rest of the road's language, how to listen for a posse that was not coming but circling, how to read a horse's hoof that was restless with war, how to check for sleepers in a wagon. That exchange of skills built respect. He watched her bend over a stump, pounding the bark into a paste, and realized the complexity of the hands that had once been dismissed as those of a woman healer. She, in turn, saw him not as the outlaw the papers shouted about, but as a man whose survival skills had been honed on the edges. He had the patience of a man who could stay quiet for days in a hayloft while danger passed, and his knowledge of ambushes and routes would become essential to protecting not only himself, but the people Esther would gather to the cause. When the gang returned the second time with questions and with the kind of suspicion that could grow teeth, Esther met them with a gaze that weighed every man like a scale. They assumed that the woman in the hogan could be bent with threats or money. One of them grabbed for the edge of her woven blanket and insulted her clan. Esther's hands, those same hands that could set a dislocated shoulder, moved with the measured force of someone who had been trained to steady the broken. She broke his wrist with a glance and a turn that used his momentum against him. No one called the deputy. The men left with a bruise and a lesson. Jonah watched, and for the first time since she stabbed willow paste into his wound, he saw a fierceness that was not merely reactionary, but exact. The alliance shifted from necessity to partnership. They had no simple trust, but they had a pact. She would keep him from the cavalry and the gang's knives. He would teach her to use his knowledge of the road to give her the upper hand when men in brass buttons came asking for more than the truth. When they moved camp to a cave above a wash, Jonah learned how to bandage not only skin, but shame, and Esther learned the strategic value of a man who had once lived on both sides of a law. That liminal knowledge, how to read both the white man's ledger and the land's omens, made them formidable. One evening, sitting by a low fire whose smoke painted the cave's ceiling in gray calligraphy, Jonah turned to her. "You ever think," he said, grinding a bit of hard bread between his teeth, "you could make more people listen?" She smiled without a humor she had saved for storms. "I know I can make people listen if the thing I say is right. That's the difference. You're not afraid of them?" he asked. "Afraid," she repeated, "is useful, but it's not the same as allowing them to take what is yours." He looked at her, and the fire reflected in his pupils. Respect settled like dust between them. They were an unlikely pair, a medicine woman defending a wounded gunslinger. But in a land that had turned the sensible into the outlaw and the righteous into the vulnerable, they needed each other's skills. That was the foundation of a partnership neither had asked for, but both had the sense to accept. The cave above the wash was not a palace, but it was enough. Esther took stock and turned necessity into routine. She saddled the mule and each morning walked the rim of her land like a sentinel. In the quiet hours, she brewed decoctions, cleaned Jonah's wound, and taught him the names of plants that could be chewed as antiseptics. By the light of a small lamp, she worked thickened resin into splints and braided cords that would hold in place until bones knit. She also taught Jonah how to listen to the smaller things, the hush before rain that meant the cavalry would have a muddier trail, the spoor that suggested a gang had passed 3 days ago rather than 3 hours. Her sense-making of the world was a map Jonah began to rely on, but it was not only practical lessons. In the cave, she began to heal more than flesh. Esther had been holding in anger, grief, and the small humiliations of dispossession like stones in the bottom of a pouch. She had been vulnerable, not a spectacle of pity, but a human upset by the slow violence of law that permitted theft. Her vulnerability had been the quiet kind, acceptance that sometimes life ended in small losses. Over cups of bitter tea, she spoke her truth. She told Jonah how the sheriff had signed papers before looking her in the eye. She told him of the carved sheep taken from a box, of her mother's last letter read by someone with gloved fingers. When she spoke, she did not plead. She spoke like a ledger ledgering wrongs and setting them down in careful ink. Jonah listened as if learning a new rote. He had known loss in different ways. Friends turned body parts on other men's ledgers. Love turned to empty promises at a back table. But he had not known the slow legal theft of life. The way she spoke revealed that she had not been broken by law alone. She'd been tested by a system that rewarded men who knew how to write their names in the right ledger. When she said she would not cede the land, it was both a personal vow and a political act. Jonah had always thought of himself as someone to outrun pain, but Esther's refusal had a gravity that made him want to be more than a shadow. Their days took on new order. Women from neighboring claims, some native, some Hispanic, some settlers of other backgrounds, came to visit either out of need for her medicine or curiosity about the woman who harbored outlaws. There was Ana Maria, a Mexican midwife who moved through life with the strength of someone who had birthed more than her own courage. May, who had washed soldiers' shirts in a fort and kept more gossip than 2 town criers. And Lillian, a settler whose husband had gone south and left her with a storefront that never paid for itself. To these women, Esther offered remedies and an ear. In return, they offered their hands and their stories. Esther transformed her Hogan into a kind of clinic, humble, private, humming with herbs and the sound of needlework. She set aside a corner for Jonah to learn instead of fighting. He learned to sew a torn coat. He learned how to stitch a pocket where a hand could hide IOUs and love letters. But most importantly, under Esther's tutelage, he learned how to listen. He watched the way she balanced the old woman's pulse and the young soldier's fever, and he saw there a kind of courage that did not rush to heroics, but measured carefully like someone weighing a newborn. He learned, too, to be patient for the slow work of healing, a lesson he would come to rely upon as the days grew more dangerous. There were small, tender scenes that settled between them. Once, after binding a child's broken arm, Esther sat back and let the smoke of the incense companionable as yard talk. Jonah, for perhaps the first time since his life had been lived under threat, tended the fire without the itch to leave. He asked, in a voice that surprised him and her, "What would you do if you could hold on to that land without them?" She looked at him then, the map of her jaw softened by light. "I would teach." I would teach those who come after me how to read the earth so they may not be cheated again." Her eyes flashed with a hope that had the steadiness of a newly set bone. She told him about the little ones she would take in to teach weaving and the songs that anchor memory. The vision was small and radical. Land used as classroom, medicine kept for people, memory turned into a future. Jonah, who had been a man of the road, surprised both of them by saying, "I can help. When it's time, I'll teach them how to watch their backs and their horizons." Those words were not about settling down. They were about learning to direct his energy toward something anchored, toward protection that didn't demand he remain the self-destructing hero of his own story. Esther heard more than flattery in his tone. There was a willingness to fold himself into something he had not considered before. Not a man who takes, but a man who shields. He would be her equal in the ways that mattered, courage tempered by respect, strength guided by deference to her choices. In that cave, while the world beyond rattled with the approaching threats of cavalry searches and gang disputes, a partnership grew where each supplied the missing piece the other required. Jonah's past was a brittle story he did not hand out like cards. Esther learned fragments. He had been a courier between small towns during the war, then a hired hand for a man who had morals like a broken clock, accurate when convenient. He'd been betrayed once by a gang who blamed him for a score he had not taken. There had been a shootout in a canyon and a decision to run that had left a friend dead. He had earned the iron mark of an outlaw because someone else had written his name in the margins of a ledger and pressed hard. At first, Esther kept his past to herself because she knew how quickly towns made legends of men. Legends were dangerous. They hardened into targets. But she also saw that his old sins had taught him a map of how lawless men moved. The hard roads and the soft spots in a posse's search, where an ambush expected tracks to read like a book. These were the skills she needed not to reclaim a deed, but to protect a community she envisioned. He taught her how to set decoys, how to make false trails by leading a mule in circles, and how to smear a path with grease to confuse scent. It was part craft and part cunning, and it made Esther uneasy at first because it required the same kind of subterfuge that had been used against her family. Still, Jonah's methods were useful. When a deputy and a lieutenant began to make more thorough inquiries, asking questions to women, prying at seams with polite menacing, the woman's clinic exchanged notes with the men who moved through the shadows. Jonah showed Esther how to plant misleading evidence in the arroyo, a dropped hat, a broken spur in a lope out of sync. She watched him at night with the meticulous hands of a man who'd knifed bread for 100 different meals, fashioning snares and fake tracks. It was uncomfortable. She hated needing to make lies to protect truth. Yet in his hands, those lies became tactical sacrifices. He taught her not to romanticize justice, but to make it practical. At the same time, Esther's moral compass shaped how these tactics would be applied. She drew lines Jonah understood. "We do not hurt innocents," she told him once, cleaning the rust from a pistol with measured strokes. "We do not lay snares for women or children. We misdirect those who come looking for blood." Jonah learned to honor her rules. In turn, he taught her that independence on the plains required a readiness to step beyond her mother's teachings when the world itself had stepped beyond fairness. As their alliance deepened, Jonah's story became a tool for Esther's justice. There was a man in town, a property speculator named Rafe McIntyre, who had his hand in more than one deed and had used cavalry favors to press claims against Navajo claims. He had signed the sheriff's auction and now wore a vest that fanned out from his chest like a map of privilege. Esther knew McIntyre was the heart of the ledger's cruelty. She also knew the law's path to him ran through the sheriff's office, and the sheriff loved his drink and his small vanities. Jonah offered his own debt to McIntyre. Years ago, McIntyre had been the fence who sold a man's promises in exchange for whiskey and a cover-up. He knew the back routes people like McIntyre used to hide bundles of papers. Jonah had been in the right place once and had looked the other way. He could find proof, a ledger, a signature brushed with sweat, if they could get close enough. Esther weighed this carefully. To use Jonah's skill was to put her cause in league with an outlaw's methods, but to refuse was to deny the practical means to hold someone accountable. She decided on a plan that married both their strengths. She would plant herself within her community, gather witnesses, women who had seen McIntyre take advantage of them, and Jonah would go into town under the guise of a drifting rider who owed coin and could buy secrets. Esther supplied the path. She told Jonah who to listen to at the bar, which men would brag and which would fold when shame was shown. This was the first time Jonah's criminal past served not only his survival, but a higher purpose. As he rode into town, wearing patched trousers and a coat that smelled faintly of sage, he took with him a small packet. a map of McIntyre's roots drawn in Esther's hand, names and dates she had gathered from conversations in her clinic. He moved among men who had once been his kind, outcasts, braggarts, and those who'd taken an easy piece of someone else's life. He took notes and memories like a man gathering tracks. He returned with a thin book of evidence, receipts tucked beneath a mattress, a soldier's dismissed complaint, a clerk's drunk remark about how easy it had been to clear property when the men were gone. When he presented this to Esther, he did so not as a gift but as a tool, an offering into the ledger of justice. She stitched the fragments together and called the women to meet in the back room of May's laundry. There, with steaming water in the basin and the smell of soap like promise, Esther's voice braided the stories into a case. Anna Maria testified about a midwife's fee turned into a tax for access. Lillian spoke about a mortgage that had been moved like a chess piece. May, who kept the town's gossip in her memory like a ledger, spoke straight about Rafe's boast that papers were for those who signed with ink, not with sweat. The case was messy and human. It was not a court record with neat lines, but it would be enough. Jonah had stepped into a role where his checks on the law's underside were wielded for repair rather than evasion. Esther kept firm the moral lines. They would expose McIntyre's misdeeds without vengeance. Jonah began to want to be the sort of man she would respect, one who used his past to fix what had been bent. In the process, their bond became less about a wound to be tended and more about a shared cause, where his outlaw knowledge served as a means to reclaim what had been unjustly taken. He was not being saved by her. He was being given a chance to be part of a justice shaped by her hand. Esther had learned, in the quiet days that kept her heart steady, that there were two kinds of survival, one that kept your body alive and one that kept your story alive. The white signers of deeds had taken the first type with paper. They had tried to erase the second with indifference. That rubbed as salt on an old wound. Every morning she swept her Hogan floor, aware that the people in town would tread always on her name if she allowed it. She could have bent. She could have sold what remained and moved on. But her sense of justice, wired as it was by generations who had survived forced routes and broken promises, would not allow that. She told the truth in ways both public and private. Privately, she wrote down names and dates in a slim journal she kept tucked under a floorboard, a ledger of the unjust. She recorded who had come to her with swollen cheeks and who had been turned away at the courthouse. She recorded the sheriff's nickname for her husband the day he signed their name, and the way the deputy smiled when he handed back a box of carved sheep. Her hand did not tremble at the act of writing. The shaking came when she read back the names. There was a righteous anger that warmed her like a slow fire. It was not about revenge, at least not in the way that rips a life apart. It was about setting the record straight, so that the next woman who stood with a child and an empty letter would have something hard to keep in her hands. When the women gathered, she set a plan as deliberate as a healing regimen. Justice would not be sudden, it would be methodical. They began with the simplest items: receipts, witness statements, the testimonies of those who had been bullied into signing deeds. Esther taught the women to look for the irregularity, an ink that smudged at a corner where the signer was led by a cold hand, or a ledger where a clerk had crossed out a week and inserted an official date. They taught themselves to notice the small things that men in power assumed women would overlook: a name's missing flourish, a margin's erasure, the coffee stain that conveniently covered a decisive line. But McIntyre did not give away his property easily. He had men who carried themselves with the sort of quiet menace that made schoolchildren cross to the other side of the street. He had influence at the fort. He had a criminal ledger the color of the sea after storms. For every small victory Esther and the women found, one name filed correctly, a clerk who admitted under pressure to turning a page. The town's respectable men tightened their smiles and sent more subtle warnings. A bill late, a grain shipment delayed, a rumor that Esther once practiced a forbidden medicine. There was a night she was cornered on the trail returning from town. Two men cloaked their faces with the gravity of a lynch and asked her for the place she kept, the Outlaw, as if a woman's domestic life could be pried like a drawer. She refused. She had no desire to bleed into another man's annals. One of them shoved her. Her ribs took the blow. Her breath came like someone expelled from water. She did not strike back then. She kept her hands near her waist where a satchel of herbs lay. She believed in avoiding unnecessary blood when a wound could be mended. But in her pocket was a sewing needle so sharp it cut the air like a thought, and she used it to prick the thigh of the one who pressed too far. He yelped, not because it injured much, but because it drew blood and shame. He retreated. The lesson spread. This woman would not be bullied into silence. Her plan solidified into a daring strategy. The ledger of McIntyre would be exposed not only by paper, but by the voices of many, led by Esther's quiet competence. The proof Jonah had scrounged would be displayed where it could not be ignored: the chapel during Sunday service and the trading post where men bought their whiskey. They would not seek to incite violence. They sought to make a scene so plainly true that the cavalry, whose loyalty tilted with outlaws and liquor, would have to reckon with a man's corruption. Esther wanted more than property. She wanted to set a precedent that would make the town think twice before it ate the next woman's rights. When they were ready, Esther stood before a collection of people who had watched her walk the line between acceptance and resistance for months. She unfolded the documents with her hands steady as a midwife's, and told the story of each sheet in a voice that did not plead but rather offered a remedy. She called witnesses: May, with her steam-smelled hands; Anna Maria, who was called to births whose mothers had been forced to sign away their children's future; Lillian, with the receipts hidden in a hat box. The town listened and then murmured, because nothing tests a town's courage like hearing its own hypocrisy read out loud. Rafe McIntyre laughed at first, the kind of high laugh that doubles as armor. He stood to argue and lost the currency of public grace when a soldier who had once been bought for a pint admitted his name had been sold too. The lieutenant's brow creased as the cavalry's loyalty was divided. Some had burned their hands on McIntyre's deals and would not be mollified. The town's rumor machine whooped and gasped. There were threats. There were men who tried to take the ledger back. Esther's hands did not shake. She watched faces and counted the grit of their souls. The town could not entirely undo its conscience. She wanted justice, not spectacle. When McIntyre's deeds were exposed, the sheriff had a choice to arrest or to keep protecting a man in his pockets. The sheriff, who feared loss of face more than the loss of a good horse, found himself outmaneuvered by a band of women who would not be cowed. The legal consequences were messy: filings, a court date, the swift manipulation of a system that loved complexity. But the social consequences were immediate. McIntyre lost customers, men stopped sitting at his table, and some of the soldiers who had once drank with him moved their coin elsewhere. It was not the total repair of everything she had lost, but it was a start. Esther had fought with a plan shaped by the wisdom of women and the tactical knowledge of a man who once lived on the wrong side of the law. The fight was hers, she had chosen it, and the allies she gathered were proof that no woman needs to stand alone. The victory was not bloodless, but it was right. She had not allowed anger to become its own master. She let it be the tool she used to reclaim what the law had not protected. In the quiet after, when the town's noise dwindled and the stars came to their windows, Jonah sat beside her and understood that her fight had been moral and necessary. He had no illusions about the road ahead. He knew that men like McIntyre did not disappear quietly. But for now, Esther had set a precedent. She had said aloud that she would not be erased, and the town had been forced to hear it. The days following the exposure of McIntyre's dealings were busy, messy, and full of consequence. There was paperwork to be filed, witnesses to be protected, and a sheriff whose mood altered like the weather. It was not a clean victory. The county court dragged its feet, and the cavalry, stubborn with their own loyalties, patrolled more often. But the community, especially the women whom Esther had galvanized, had found their tongues. They began to act with the confidence of those who know that their stories matter. Esther stood at the center of it all, and Jonah stood beside her, not in front. Their partnership was practiced and proud. Plans were made in whispers and over the wash of May's laundry, where the women scrubbed and talked and planned over the steam. Esther's voice carried the practicalities: what documents to seek, which signatures to force by witness. Jonah provided movement. He reminded them of the roads that led away from town, the stash spots, and how to mislead those who came sniffing. But as they worked, the lines that had once separated them blurred. Jonah learned how to hold a pen with reverence as Esther wrote affidavits and found the art of small, precise politeness. Esther learned how to ride with a saddle's quiet that did not need a stagecoach's spectacle. Intimacy between them did not arrive as a lightning strike, but rather as a series of careful moments that rewired expectations. Jonah was not the kind to offer grand romantic gestures. He offered instead practical attention, bringing water when she worked late, watching the children she taught so she could run errands, keeping his back visible when they walked a town street. Esther, in turn, did not let him shoulder her burdens. She asked for help where she needed it and refused assistance where she believed a woman must stand alone to teach strength to others. They argued when necessary, about tactics, about the line between justice and revenge, and each argument was an exchange of equals. Jonah grew under her tutelage, and sometimes led with knowledge she lacked. He taught the women how to read the tracks of a pursuing cavalry, where to hide meat so scavengers would miss it, and how to clear a trail of scent by using smoke and salt. But in the same breath, Esther taught him the art of patience, to wait for the fever to break rather than hack at a wound, to listen to a child's silence rather than demand noise, to see a woman's eyes for the story she did not tell. He learned that violence could be redirected into strategy and that gentleness was a form of strength that kept people whole. Other women became part of that equal partnership. Anna Maria, who had once been a midwife delivering more than babies, delivering courage, became the keeper of pills and soothed birthing women when fear marched like cavalry. May kept a ledger of her own, scribbled in the margins of laundry lists, and used the gossip she'd collected to steer the town's conversations. Lillian, who had been stripped of leverage, learned to keep accounts for women who wanted to pool their money for legal fees. When the town came to them with questions of property and kin, they formed a council. It was not a council that demanded authority over men's business. Rather, it was a way to teach women that a ledger of their own handled with craftsmanship and stubbornness could outlast any sheriff's quick nod. Their growing trust changed private matters too. Esther and Jonah shared silence comfortably, the kind of quiet that lets two people know they are not alone. Once, after a night of repairing fences and arguing about the merits of a certain ambush, Jonah took Esther's hand and placed a bullet she had kept on her palm. "For safety," he said, his voice rough with a tenderness he did not usually show. She laughed, a short, bright sound, and slipped the bullet into the hollow of her boot. "For the bad," she said, and the answer was both practical and tender. It was not that either of them needed the other to be whole, it was that they had found in one another someone who matched their pace and refused to dominate it. Their partnership was tested by smaller cruelties that men in authority still flung their way. A deputy who arrived with thin legal threats, the cavalry that questioned Jonah's presence near her claim, neighbors who assumed she would bend if pushed hard enough. Esther stood firm in court, not as a damsel asking for mercy, but as a woman insisting on equality. Jonah sat in the back with the other outcasts and watched as the town's members had to look at the truth she used as her shield. As the months passed, their equal partnership became more visible in the way they farmed the land together, in the way Jonah would hold the mule steady while Esther threaded a bit of bone through leather to mend a harness. They were love sewn into the fabric of a life that was both public and private, practical and spiritual. Their love did not erase the injustices they fought, it strengthened the hands they used to fight them. Mountain seasons change in sudden gusts. Esther felt the shift in the air like a pulse under the ground. The town had not forgiven her for exposing McIntyre. The sheriff simmered a resentment that made him dangerous in polite company. The cavalry's patrols had increased, and Rafe's disgraced allies sought revenge in quieter ways. Jonah's old enemies circled like hawks. The thing that had been a plan, now, sat on a knife edge. She faced a simple, brutal choice. Keep the life they had built in the shadows, safe, small, and almost entirely private, or risk open confrontation in the name of full justice and long-term security for the women she had rallied. The first choice promised safety, but left too much unclaimed. The township could still steal the land next season with a different set of men. The second choice was dangerous. It might undo everything and put the women at hazard. Esther weighed the options like someone weighing herbs for a potent remedy. A pinch too much would poison. That evening, under a sky shot with a knife of moonlight, Jonah sat beside her on a low rock outside the Hogan. They had a cup of bitter juniper tea between them. He could smell of saddle and smoke, and she could smell of willow and soap. He did not try to nudge her toward a decision. He knew, deeply, that it had to be her own. "You don't have to fix the whole world at once," he said softly, eyes on the stars. "I never wanted to fix the whole world at once," she answered. "I want to fix the part I can reach." There was a pause where the night listened. Jonah's usual certainties, motion, flight, immediate action, thinned into something like patience. He looked at Esther, and in the long look she saw both the outlaw he had been and something new, a man willing to risk more than survival to stand with her in a fight of cause. She pictured a future, humble but whole, a small school on the edge of her arroyo where girls learned to read the law and the land, a clinic where women could find help not priced by a sheriff's favor, a hearth that didn't tremble when men with contracts came to call. It was a life of slow repair, of tending and teaching. To secure it, they would have to risk the cavalry's condemnation and Rafe's enmity. It would require exposing corruption publicly in a town where men still expected women to be soft bargaining chips. "You can leave," she said finally. Her voice was steady. You can ride on, take a road, and forget this place. There is no shame in that. Jonah's hand tightened around his cup. He looked at her as if he were considering an old route. I didn't come back because of saving my hide, he said. I came back because of you. Her chest warmed and then cooled. She loved the idea of him beside her, but she wanted love born of mutual choice, not obligation. I will not ask you to stay because you owe me, she said. If you stay, it must be because you want this as much as I do. Jonah swallowed and then nodded. I want this, he said simply. I want to help make the land safe for those who live on it and the women who raise the children. If you lead, I will follow. Not because I own you, but because I choose it. That sentence, clear, informed, offered without pressure, was exactly what she had hoped for. She had been broken before by men who decided her worth. This was different. It was a man meeting her as an equal and saying he wanted to stand beside her. The choice was hers to make, and she embraced it. They drew a quiet plan that night and let themselves imagine a small happiness that was not a rescue, but a mutual shelter. In that hush, they allowed themselves a measure of tenderness. Jonah took her hand and kept it in both of his, a gesture less about possession and more about solidarity. They allowed themselves the secret joy of imagining children, perhaps not theirs, but those of women they taught, learning to read and sew and plant. Two people sat under a patient sky and planned a life that they would build together on their terms. It was the calm before a storm. They both knew the risks. The town's resentments had not faded. Men like McIntyre, even if discredited, had friends who would not forget favors. There would be a day when the cavalry would knock louder, or when Jonah's past would return with new, sharper teeth. But the choice had been made. Esther would not cede another inch. Jonah would not claim her like a prize. They were partners by choice, not by fate. They slept that night with hands entangled and a small, shared confidence warming them like embers. Whatever came next, each knew the other had chosen, and that made all the difference. Peace, in that arid country, was always an uneasy arrangement. Men who had been humiliated in public found private theaters in which to rehearse their revenge. McIntyre's friends, stung and shamed, began to plot more quietly than their earlier bluster. Rafe himself was gone from town, but his influence had tendrils. A deputy with old debts in his pockets, and a foreman who had been paid in whiskey rather than wages, were the kinds to act on rumor more than on law. They conspired in corners, wrote letters, and told tales which swelled into the sort of wrath that always seeks the woman who defied. The cavalry's presence, too, grew heavier. A new lieutenant arrived. He carried orders differently, less about maintaining peace, more about preserving lines of authority. The old calculations of justice were being reshaped to favor property and appointment. Esther noted it in the way soldiers asked for extra oaths, in the way their boots were more polished than before, in the way frontier justice sought out men like Jonah with eagerness. Then there were the older adversaries, the gang that had once blamed Jonah for a killing and had never forgiven him. They circled like blood-hungry hawks. They'd been quiet for a time, but when men feel wronged, they look for the simpler solution, to recapture a face that once fled. The gang's leader, a man called Crowley with a jaw the color of iron ore, took to spreading rumors in the saloons that Jonah had betrayed friends for coin. Men who needed the moral simplicity of a villain found Jonah useful. All these forces converged in a way that forced Esther and Jonah to recalibrate. It was no longer simply a matter of paperwork and witness statements. The town's politics had sharpened into weapons. A soldier found a way to call Jonah to attention on a public road and accused him of theft. The gang set a trap on a service trail that ran near the arroyo where Esther taught weaving. A rider in plain clothes corralled the younger women from the community under the pretense of a market exchange, and then left them vulnerable to intimidation. The sheriff, who had been balancing his pockets and his conscience, slid toward the side with the most power. Esther refused to be cowed. She refused to let the conspiracy reduce her life to reaction. She gathered the women quietly and strategized like an elder woman planning a feast, thinking of who would carry what and when. They pooled supplies, moved their small valuables to safe places, and set up signals like a girl's game. A white cloth draped where it would catch a neighbor's eye meant danger. A single orange ribbon at the wash meant the cavalry was near. The women trained in stealth, in how to move without startling a posse, in how to make a trail read like a farmer's normal commute. Jonah worked the roads too, not in bravado, but with a careful, watchful skill. He set decoys, false camps, and false trails. He used his knowledge of the gang's habits to predict their moves. Yet as the danger amplified, he suggested taking preemptive action that made Esther uneasy, raids that risked innocent lives, and could harden them into the very criminals they fought. Each time he suggested such measures, Esther forced him to reframe them, to think of defense rather than striking first. Their combined leadership attracted allies beyond their small circle. A handful of soldiers who had grown disillusioned with the lieutenant's tilt toward land claims allied quietly with them, men who remembered a time when the cavalry tried to preserve order rather than prop up speculators. A scout, Kin Nash, a half-breed who had a reliable sense for the land's quieter weather, lent his eye to the plan. He taught them to read the ground at night, where a horse's tracks were likely to have been lifted in haste. Yet betrayal came in a form no one expected. A younger woman who had once been helped by Esther, and then taken by guilt or greed into McIntyre's orbit, revealed, under pressure, the location of the cave where Jonah had recuperated. The young woman, Lori, had been quietly courted by one of McIntyre's men, who promised safety and coin, the way the town promised prosperity, in exchange for silence. When the gang moved in on the cave, Jonah and a handful of women managed to slip into a narrow fissure that opened onto a sagebrush-lined rise. The fight was quick and brutal. Jonah used stealth learned on the road, and woman after woman used their learned cunning, throwing jars of ash and smoke, setting traps the way they would for coyotes, to make the ambush messy and humiliating for their attackers. They did not win without cost. Jonas took a new wound, this time a light in his shoulder that slowed his hand but did not stop it. A young woman named Lillian, who had once been afraid of her own rage, stepped forward and with a raw anger struck the gang leader's arm, a small act that might have been worse for her if there had not been women around to push her back. The message had been delivered. The community would not be easy prey, but the forces were more cunning than brute. The lieutenant, who disliked being undermined, pressed for legal authority and used the town's own fear to justify a sweeping search. The searches were irregular and bordered on harassment. They ransacked the homes of women who had opposed McIntyre, looking for outlaws and, in the process, stealing stories and goods. It was a pressure meant to break the spirit. Esther found herself waking at night with the taste of dust and anger on her tongue, measuring the next move like a midwife measures contractions. Timing mattered. She refused to be victim again. Where fear might have made others quiet, she spoke. She wrote a formal letter to an officer she knew had once liked her husband's sheep, putting in precise language the wrongs done and documenting each search, each theft. The letter landed with a sharpness that surprised even her. The officer, a colonel who had a reputation for fairness, called for an inquiry. The town's conspirators hissed, but it was a small victory. And critically, it showed that systems could be used against those who thought themselves above scrutiny. The plotting did not stop, but the conspiracy's path was now less certain. The forces arrayed against Esther and those she protected still had teeth and numbers. Yet the woman had become a leader who moved like a river, sometimes slow, sometimes crashing, but always cutting new ways. Jonah, for all his past of running, stood in the middle of it, no longer alone, ready to shoulder the fight with the woman who had taught him a different way to use the road. They would face the darkest hour yet, and when it arrived, the story would demand that Esther become more than healer and teacher. She would become a leader for the whole of her people. The night the cavalry came with a warrant for Jonah's arrest, it came with a kind of righteousness that the law-trained men felt as taut as harness leather. The lieutenant who'd arrived months ago brought with him a captain who wore a certainty like armor. They came not because of the evidence that had once been planted against Jonah, but because someone in the town had made certain their cause would be the right one. The deputy, lazy but with the kind of zeal that made him dangerous, rounded up men and set a line across the arroyo. Esther watched them from the ridge with the clarity of a woman who understood what was at stake. Jonah stood with the other men on the soil below, hand near his gun. He refused to bolt. He had chosen to stand. For a breath, they were a tableau, outlaw and medicine woman, soldier and town. The cavalry moved in slow as a clock, and the injured man felt every eye like a needle. Then came Lori, the woman who had betrayed them. She arrived not with the swagger of a villain, but with a dawning shame that made her face streaked and small. She had come perhaps to confess, perhaps because guilt had gnawed too loud. She told a story that would have been a soft knife. Her father had loans, and she had taken the path men offered her because she had been frightened. She told the captain where the cave had been, the cavalry's jaws set like a trap. The captain called for Jonah. He came forward, slow, because running was a way Jonah had lived before, and he had chosen otherwise. The captain recited a litany of charges, possession of stolen goods, suspicion of violent acts, and then ordered a search of the women's homes as well. The town barked with approval. It was the kind of moment the law loved, neat, theatrical, and predictive. Esther stepped forward then, into the middle of a whirl of hats and polished brass. She had a voice that did not tremble because there was nothing left to tremble about. She had stripped down fear until it was a useful tool. She demanded witnesses be heard and evidence be produced. The captain sneered, sure of his authority, and called for compliance. For the first time, the law and the women stood nose to nose. The cavalry pushed into the hogan, ransacking with the impunity of those who believed in paper more than pulse. They overturned bedding and pried up floorboards. They found Esther's small ledger and read it like blasphemy. Jonah was shackled in the yard while they tore at her things. It was then the worst of Esther's fears came true. The social apparatus of the town clattered to the ground and reasserted itself in the form of men with guns and an audience of comfortable onlookers. Inside they found little, some old skeins of yarn, a small bone needle, a stack of letters, and yet the men clenched at them like they had found a gold cache. Jonah's chest heaved. Esther felt anger like ice water in scarce veins. The captain declared them conspirators. He ordered the women to be quiet. He mocked the men who had come to their defense. He let the deputy make the accusations that fueled the soldiers' zeal. The worst came when the captain announced he would take Jonah to fort and try him there. Jonah's jaw clenched. His eyes flicked at Esther as if to ask what she would do. She had seen worse than a man taken away. She had seen a system remove dignity with red tape. She could have sworn and stormed, but that would play into the hands of those who wanted spectacle. Instead, she called upon an ancient strategy to hold truth as both mirror and blade. Esther had anticipated this moment. She had hidden copies of the receipts and affidavits among the laundry bundles, had sent a runner, one of the disillusioned cavalrymen who had allied with them, to the colonel who had once liked her husband's sheep. She had a wild, clear faith that even systems corrupt enough to steal land still contained enough order to hear truth if pressed hard enough. When the captain moved to take Jonah away under a cloud, a courier arrived with a formal inquiry authorized by the colonel. The cavalry halted, and for a breath the town's noise turned to hush. That was when the real treachery arrived. Rafe McIntyre's friends, seeing the possibility of a legal unraveling, set fires along the boundary of the claims to the east. It was a low, cunning arson meant to distract and frighten. The fire leapt with a cruelty that burned at the boundary of the land Esther called hers. It devoured fence and post and gnawed at the nerve of the cattle. The men with the captain rushed to the fires, and in the chaos, a group from the gang struck back at Jonah and the women. They used the confusion to take a shot that nicked Jonah's side and knocked him down. In that darker hour, Esther's resolve hardened into a blade. She moved with the ferocious calm of someone who had lost more than she had thought and thus learned to be remorseless about saving others. She pulled Jonah into shelter, dragged him into the smokehouse with a rope and a splint, and called the women to line the border. They fought back not with revenge, but with protection. They formed human shields, set out false fires, sounded alarms to confuse horses and cause riders to misread the trail. The captain returned and found a town in flames and men in chaos. The lieutenant, who had once tilted toward law, now realized his authority could be compromised. He called for restraint. Jonah lived because of fast hands and because Esther would not let him die. Lillian, who had once been fearful, stood like a dam of strength and carried water across the burning fence line. Anna Maria tended to the wounded with a stoicism that made even the cavalry hush. The women's solidarity turned the tide of a night that could have swallowed them. By dawn, the town had a smoldering edge and a new map. The fort sent a messenger. The captain, exposed by the colonel's inquiry and the atrocities of the arson, had to report. Jonah's name remained on paper as suspect, but there were those who had watched him saved by Esther's hands and who could not reconcile that simple deed with the notion of a villain. The gang fled or were captured. The deputy swallowed his pride, and Rafe McIntyre's last connectors retreated. Esther sat by the ash-strewn wash and held the journal in which she had written the names of the wrongs. The night had taken blood and breath. She had survived. Jonah, lean and quiet, slid a hand over hers and did not attempt to speak for her. He had been saved by her and had saved other things as well. The darkest hour had come and the woman had not broken. She had been tempered into the shape of the leader she had been destined to become. After the fires and the night of gun and smoke, the town held its breath and then began to sort itself into what would remain. The cavalry's inquiry led to gentle reprimands, some resignations, and the quiet transfer of a few men away from the county. McIntyre's last holdouts evaporated like smoke in a wind. But the real victory was subtler. People had seen the women not as whispers behind screens, but as a force that could rally, plan, and execute when push came to shove. Esther's leadership was no longer whispered. It became a practical institution. She opened the Hogan's back room as a gathering place for women who needed advice on claims or midwives to speak with. She began hosting mornings of teaching, lessons on reading property records, simple account keeping, and the kinds of herbal remedies that could help a fever when the town's doctor delayed. The women learned to testify in court and to hold their voices like steady tools. They practiced giving depositions and watching faces. The men learned to see them not only as wives or widows, but as witnesses whose knowledge mattered. Jonah's role changed, too. He had once been a man who fled or fought, a person whose story belonged to the road. Now he took on a role of protector that was neither possessive nor passive. He taught young men, boys mostly, but others too, how to ride with the humility of someone who knew both the road and the weight of obligation. He trained them in the art of guarding property and, more importantly, in watching for injustice disguised as law. The final confrontation that would seal Esther's transformation was not a single battle, but a carefully staged reclamation. The town had transferred a set of disputed deeds to a small court hearing. Esther and the women brought testimonies, receipts, and the ledger of McIntyre's receipts Jonah had found. They brought witnesses who no longer trembled. The trial was raw. Lawyers tried to twist phrases and to butter the ears of men with promises. But the evidence, hard, stubborn, documented, cut through. Esther stood in front of the makeshift court inside the trading post, sun cutting the dust into thin lines. She was no longer the woman who had wrapped bandages in the shadows. Her shape had sharpened into that of a leader, hair tied back with a ribbon, hands steady, feet that had walked her land and beyond. She looked at the faces of men who had once dismissed her and felt neither rage nor the need to relish victory. She felt only that sense of dignity that comes from rightness. The judge, a man with more patience than malice, read the facts slowly and declared in a voice that felt like release. The deeds had been improperly obtained. The auction was invalid. He ordered titles reassigned, debts reapportioned, and a small reparative fund to help those who had lost goods returned to them. The crowd outside the trading post murmured like a wind through grass. Someone clapped, and soon more joined. Tears came to Esther's eyes, not because the fight was over, but because her work had brought a measure of justice. In the weeks that followed, Esther's life continued to transform. She and Jonah remodeled a small house near the Hogan where they could host classes. Lillian ran the register and kept accounts for women who wanted to pool savings for land. Anna Maria started a birthing circle where she trained apprentices. The community grew stronger because it had learned to hold its own ledger. Women who'd once been alone now had a band. There was a day when Esther stood at the edge of a field and taught a group of girls to knit wool into a pattern that told a story. She taught them how to mark a border not only with a fence but with knowledge. Jonah watched from the shade of a juniper and came over to kneel beside her. He did not ask for her hand the way old romances do with a flourish. He spoke softly. "You led them." She looked at him with both the softness that had been her tendency and the steel she had learned. "We led them," she corrected. "You were beside me." They had become equals in truth and in practice. Their love, when it came, was a quiet folding of hands across a table of plans. They married in a small ceremony, more like a promise between kin than a theater. The ceremony was simple: blessings from the elders, a call to remember the land, Jonah and Esther exchanging their names in a way that said partnership rather than possession. Men and women stood, neighbors, allies, the soldiers who had grown disillusioned, and watched. As months slipped into years, Esther's land became a place of teaching and refuge. She began a small school wherein legal literacy was as important as herbal lore. Her students were diverse: Navajo girls with braids and quiet eyes, Spanish-speaking women with sharp minds, and settler boys who came with curiosity instead of entitlement. She pressed into the ethos the idea that knowing the law was a form of self-defense. Women, once marginalized in the town's ledger, began to run for small offices, petition the fort for help when needed, and consult the Hogan before making major deals. Esther's clinic remained a center, but its influence widened. She and Jonah stood not only as guardians but as partners who had built a life on mutual respect. When trouble came, a new speculator sniffing the air, they counseled, strategized, and, when needed, took the fight to the right channels. But the most profound change was Esther herself. The woman who had once sat with grief and sewn it into quilts had become a leader who could mend and shape the very fabric of her community. She had learned to wield both gentleness and force, to call witnesses, and to protect those who testified. Her transformation was not clean or painless. It was full-blooded and wise, stitched with the hands that had once sewn up wounds in a dark cave. The days of contest slowly shaped into the season of repair. The final test of what Esther had built came not with a single gunfight, but with a public reckoning. When the county called for a formal review of the deeds and for a hearing in the district seat, it would be long, it would be public, and it would be full of men with money and authority who believed they could bend the story back into their favor. Esther prepared the way as a healer prepares a delicate patient for a complicated surgery, methodically, patiently, with care. She collected witnesses who could swear to McIntyre's misdeeds, preserved receipts and the ledger of the men who'd been bribed, and cultivated the support of soldiers who had seen the truth and men in town who had finally tired of a life ruled by private advantage. She taught the women how to stand firm under cross-examination, gave them scripts that were honest and unembellished, and practiced with them until their voices had the steady sound of knowledge. Jonah rode to the district seat with her, not as protector in a traditional sense, but as companion and recorder. He had matured into a man who could listen and keep still. His eye for the road helped to anticipate danger, but his heart had learned that the true fight was for the women who would come after. The journey to court was long and lined with people who watched them pass like a parade. The hearing itself was a drawn-out affair. Lawyers in clean coats tried to entangle testimony in legal webs. Men with vested interests tried to bribe or bully. Yet the combined narrative, the ledger, the women's testimonies, the soldiers' admissions, and Jonah's evidence, was too consistent to unravel. Esther stood in the witness chair and spoke in a voice without theatrics. She told them plainly of the taking of the carved sheep, of a box of letters read aloud by greedy hands, of threats that had tried to break her back. She informed the court not of wild vengeance, but of a precise list of offenses, the kind the law pretends to admire. It was a long process, and there were moments when the system tried to crush hope with bureaucracy. The opposing counsel would look for slips and then pounce. Yet each time they attempted to tear at a seam, Esther and the women had another piece of evidence. Their preparation had been exacting. When the judge finally weighed the papers and testimony, his verdict was a kind of slow thunder. The deeds were voided, restitution ordered in part for stolen goods, and the sheriff reprimanded for negligence. Some of McIntyre's allies were arrested for fraud. There was no short, clean victory. It was messy and slow and required ongoing legal work. There were reparations that did not undo what had been stolen, and the town had to reckon with the damage wrought by men whose appetites had been sanctioned by the law for too long. But the scale had tipped, and the trajectory of the town had changed. Women now stood in lines at the registry and were treated with a different courtesy. Soldiers were less cavalier in their dealings with the civilians they policed because they had seen the consequences of unexamined power. What made the triumph more meaningful than the legal decision was what came after. Esther used the ruling not to gloat but to build. She started a cooperative fund where women could pool resources to buy and hold land together, making it difficult for unscrupulous men to pry parcels apart. She set up a legal help desk in May's Laundry, where women could bring disputes and be guided step by step. The clinic expanded into a training center for midwives and a small school that taught girls and boys how to read the law as well as the land. These were practical measures to ensure the victory would last. Jonah, who had once been a man with a price on his head, found redemption in service. He worked with the young men she taught, showing them how to press plow, mend fences, and use a gun as a last resort rather than a first. He taught them the road's sense, how to be visible without being seductive to the law's worst tendencies. He also learned from Esther how to take responsibility for the harms of the past and to help repair them with hands rather than speeches. There was love in their partnership, but it was not the kind that erased the woman's agency. Rather, it was love that made both of them better at being themselves. Jonah's loyalty did not define her. Her wisdom coaxed him into a fuller self. They leaned into a love that expected equality and demanded the freedom to choose. They were not an old-fashioned rescue story, but a duet of equals whose strengths overlapped and completed one another. The town, now infiltrated with the quiet strength of women who'd learned to bind wounds and read deeds, was different. It no longer accepted theft cloaked as law. It had been taught a steadier ethic. Esther's clinic became a symbol, not of a woman's fragility, but of a woman's capability. Her legacy became more than a legal reversal. It was a reweaving of a social fabric that once held holes. Years later, when the summers had loosened into their slow, honeyed rhythms, Esther stood on the porch of a house she had helped build with hands both crude and tender. The house was a place of work and welcome, a blending of the Hogan's traditions and some practical Western touches. Its garden grew the herbs she had always known, plus vegetables that had been new to her until she taught herself to plant them in neat rows. A small schoolhouse sat next to the garden where children learned to read both the ledger and the lore. She was 46 now, age marked by lines that were not unkind but spoken of weather and laughter. Her hair, once a black river, held threads of silver she wore like an honored badge. Her garments had shifted from the rough shawls of hard months to a mix of woven patterns and sturdy fabrics that spoke to a woman who knew how to move between worlds. She still carried a needle in a pocket and a bullet tucked softly beneath a hem. Safety and skill, side by side. Jonah stood beside her, not as a savior but as a partner who had been shaped by the life they built. He had given up the road and kept its wisdom. He taught at the school sometimes, instructing young boys and men in the skills of observation and restraint. He kept a small coffer on the porch where he placed a note whenever he completed some repair or lesson, an odd little ritual that made them both laugh. Their life was not a fairy tale without scars. There were nights when the memory of fires and a man's menacing grin crept into their sleep. There were errands that required they revisit a courtroom. There were long evenings when the work of being a community center tired them, but what surpassed the fatigue was a deep contentment, a sense that what they had fought for mattered to someone beside them and to those who would come after. Other women prospered by the ripple of Esther's work. Anna Maria ran the birthing circle with apprentices across the valleys. May's laundry had transformed into a small legal help office where women received counsel and kindness. Lillian managed the cooperative fund, shepherding savings like a careful bird. Women who had once relied upon men to sign away their fates now signed their own names. The change was not instantaneous for everyone, but it was tangible. Children grew up learning that a woman's voice could reroute an entire town. One afternoon, Esther addressed the women of the valley in a small assembly beneath a cottonwood. She spoke of the work they had done together, of the nights they had kept each other's fires, and of the future they would shape for the girls who braided their hair in the sun. She reminded them, as she always had, that knowledge is a kind of armor and community a kind of shelter. To the women listening, those whose faces were weathered like hers and those younger, with the spark of something yet untested, she delivered a message she had grown into, that strength could be gentle, and that gentleness could be strong. She told them, "We do not need to become what the law says a leader must be. We need to be present, persistent, and principled. Hold your knowledge like a knife that only cuts when it must." And now, to you listening to this story. And so her story ends where yours continues. She was told she was broken, but she proved them wrong. She was left for dead at a rim where the arroyo runs cold, but she rose stronger. She was meant to be silent at the courthouse, but she spoke, and the town had to listen. If you are a woman who has been knocked down but refused to stay down, if you have a story of being told no or of being pushed to the margins because of your age, your heritage, or the color of your hands, then you already share a bloodline with Esther. If you believe that it's never too late to reclaim your power, if you know the strongest love is built between equals who hold each other up, then you've found your people. Follow the women who do not wait to be rescued. Subscribe to witness more legends of women who refused to be victims, who turned pain into power, who reshaped their towns and their lives on their own terms. Like this story, if you believe every woman deserves a second chance at happiness framed by dignity and choice, share it with every woman who needs to remember her own strength. Hit that bell, sister, because these stories aren't just entertainment. They're reminders that you are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and worthy of a love that sees you as the hero you truly are. Live with the stubborn conviction Esther carried. Tend your wounds, learn the law, gather your sisters, and never let another person write your ending.